The rain hammered against the stained glass windows of St. Catherine's Church like an omen, each droplet a tiny fist against the sacred walls. I stood at the altar in my grandmother's vintage wedding dress, the ivory silk heavy with moisture from the humidity that had seeped into the old stone building. The weight of the fabric felt like chains around my legs, binding me to this moment I no longer wanted. Marcus Wellington III stood beside me in his perfect navy suit, his blonde hair slicked back with precision that matched everything else about his life. Controlled, calculated, cold. His blue eyes held no warmth as he recited the vows his family's lawyers had probably written for him. The Wellingtons had been planning this union for months, ever since they'd discovered the mountain of debt I'd inherited from my grandmother's medical bills. "To have and to hold," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily through the ornate church. But his words weren't meant for me. They were meant for the small gathering of his business associates, the men in expensive suits who sat in the front pews like vultures waiting for a feast. That's when I heard it, the whispered conversation that changed everything. Marcus had turned slightly toward his best man, James Thornton, thinking the organ music would mask their voices. But I caught every word that fell from his lips like poison. "Once we finalize the honeymoon paperwork, the transfer will be complete," Marcus murmured, his smile never wavering as he spoke to me, but meant the words for James. "She'll never discover the offshore accounts or the other contracts. The teacher has no idea what she's signing away." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Other contracts. Offshore accounts. This wasn't about love or even desperate circumstances. This was about something far more sinister, and I was nothing more than a pawn in whatever game the Wellington family was playing. The priest continued his ceremony, oblivious to the fact that my world was crumbling beneath the ivory silk of my grandmother's dress. The same dress she'd worn when she married my grandfather in this very church 60 years ago. She'd believed in love then. She'd believed in forever. I wasn't going to make her mistake. "If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be wed, speak now, or forever hold your peace." The silence stretched like a held breath. Marcus's grip on my hand tightened, his fingers pressing against my grandmother's antique ring until it bit into my skin. A warning. A reminder that I belonged to him now, body and soul and whatever debts he'd convinced me I owed. But I didn't belong to anyone. "I object," I whispered, so quietly that only Marcus heard me. His perfect smile faltered for just a moment. "Bella, don't be ridiculous. We've come this far." "I object," I said again, louder this time. Loud enough for the priest to hear, for the vultures in their expensive suits to turn and stare. "I can't do this. I won't do this." The words tumbled from my lips like a dam breaking. 26 years of being told what to do, what to want, what to accept, finally bursting free. I yanked my hand from Marcus's grip and stepped back, the train of my dress catching on the altar steps. "Bella," Marcus's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, "think very carefully about what you're doing. Your debts won't disappear just because you've developed cold feet. Neither will your secrets." I shot back, surprised by the steel I heard in my own voice. That's when I saw it. The flash of something dark and violent in his perfect blue eyes, something that made me understand exactly what kind of man I'd almost married. The kind who made other contracts, the kind who kept secrets that required lawyers and offshore accounts and business associates who looked like they'd stepped out of a crime novel. I gathered up my skirts and ran. The rain hit me like a slap as I burst through the church doors, soaking through the vintage silk in seconds. My grandmother's carefully preserved dress clung to my legs, making each step a struggle as I fled across the parking lot. Behind me, I could hear Marcus shouting, his composure finally cracking as his perfect plan fell apart. The storm had emptied the streets, leaving them slick and gleaming under the amber streetlights. I had no car, no money, no plan beyond getting as far away from St. Catherine's as possible. My phone was back in the church with my purse, along with everything else I'd brought to my own funeral disguised as a wedding. That's when I saw it, a sleek black Maserati idling beneath the marquee of the Grand Hotel, its engine purring like a predator waiting to strike. Steam rose from its hood, mixing rain and heat, and through the windshield, I could see the silhouette of a man holding a phone to his ear, Desperation makes people do stupid things. Desperation makes school teachers from broken families climb into strangers' cars in the middle of thunderstorms, because any unknown danger feels safer than the known threat chasing them through the rain. I yanked open the rear passenger door and threw myself inside, my sodden wedding dress spreading across the leather seats like spilled milk. The interior smelled of expensive cologne and something darker underneath. Danger, maybe. Or power. The kind of scent that clings to men who never have to ask twice for what they want. The man in the driver's seat ended his phone call with a sharp curse and turned to look at me through the rearview mirror. I caught a glimpse of dark hair, sharp cheekbones, and eyes the color of winter storms before he spoke. "What the hell?" "Please," I interrupted, my voice breaking on the word. "Please, just drive. I'll pay you whatever the meter says. I'll give you everything I have." He stared at me for a long moment, those storm-colored eyes taking in my soaked appearance, the vintage dress, the desperation that must have been written across my face in neon letters. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, more controlled, with an accent that wrapped around his words like silk over steel. "Lady, this isn't a taxi. I don't care what it is. I just need to get away from here. Please." Lightning split the sky behind us, illuminating the church where Marcus was probably mobilizing his business associates to find his runaway bride. The man in the driver's seat seemed to weigh his options, his gaze flicking between me and something in his rearview mirror. Then he put the car in gear. "Buckle up," he said, and we disappeared into the storm-dark streets of the city. It wasn't until we'd driven several blocks that he spoke again, his voice cutting through the sound of rain against glass and the soft purr of the engine. "So, runaway bride, want to tell me what you're running from?" I met his eyes in the rearview mirror, those impossible storm-gray depths that seemed to see straight through me. My wedding. That much was obvious. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth, visible even in profile. "What I'm curious about is what made you desperate enough to jump into a complete stranger's car. You wouldn't understand. Try me." Something in his voice made me believe he might actually understand the kind of desperation that drives a person to burn their entire life down in a single moment. So I told him about Marcus, about the whispered conversation, about the debts and the contracts and the feeling that I'd been nothing more than a signature on paperwork to the man I'd almost married. He listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making a soft sound that might have been sympathy or understanding. When I finished, he was quiet for so long I thought he might not respond at all. Then he said the words that should have terrified me, but somehow didn't. "Lady, you just escaped your wedding and climbed into the car of the most dangerous man in this city." The wrought iron gates swung open like the jaws of some ancient beast, revealing a driveway that stretched through manicured gardens toward a mansion that shouldn't exist in the real world. I pressed my face to the rain-streaked window, watching as we climbed toward a structure that belonged in architectural magazines, or the fevered dreams of men with more money than morality. "What is this place?" I whispered, my breath fogging the glass. "Home," he said simply, as if that single word explained everything. The Maserati came to a stop beneath a covered portico, where men in dark suits materialized from shadows I hadn't noticed before. They moved with the fluid precision of dancers, but there was nothing graceful about the bulges beneath their jackets, or the way their eyes swept the surroundings with military alertness. My rescuer, my captor, I was beginning to realize, stepped out of the car and straightened to his full imposing height. In the soft lighting of the portico, I got my first clear look at him. 6'3" at least, with the kind of build that spoke of discipline and violence kept carefully in check. His dark hair was styled with expensive precision, and his face was all sharp angles and classical features that belonged on Roman statues. Beautiful in the way predators are beautiful, dangerous in ways I was only beginning to understand. "Signore Gambino," one of the suited men said, opening my door with deferential courtesy. "Everything is prepared as you requested. Gambino." The name hit me like a physical blow. Even a sheltered art teacher from the suburbs knew that name, whispered in news reports and crime documentaries, spoken with fear and respect in equal measure. I'd climbed into the car of Lorenzo Gambino, and now I understood exactly what he'd meant about being the most dangerous man in the city. "I need to go home," I said, not moving from the back seat. My grandmother's dress had dried into wrinkled silk that clung to my skin like a second layer of anxiety. This is a mistake. I shouldn't be here. Lorenzo leaned down to meet my gaze, those storm-gray eyes holding mine with unsettling intensity. You're not leaving, Isabel. Not until I understand why Marcus Wellington was marrying a nobody teacher with nothing to offer his family fortune. The casual cruelty of his words stung, but it was the accuracy that truly wounded. I was nobody special, just another casualty of circumstances beyond my control. But hearing it stated so bluntly by a man who probably destroyed lives before breakfast made something fierce unfurl in my chest. My name is Bella, I said, lifting my chin. And if I'm such a nobody, why do you care who I marry? Something that might have been approval flickered across his features. Because nobodies don't run from their weddings unless they've discovered something that scares them more than poverty. And because Marcus Wellington doesn't marry anyone without a very good reason. He gestured for me to exit the car. And though it felt like stepping into quicksand, I climbed out into the humid night air. The mansion loomed above us, all glass and stone and expensive shadows, while armed men watched our every move from positions I was only beginning to notice. The interior was even more intimidating than the exterior. Marble floors stretched across spaces large enough to hold my entire apartment building, while artwork that probably cost more than I'd earn in a lifetime adorned walls that soared toward coffered ceilings. Everything whispered of power and wealth accumulated over generations, the kind of money that bought silence and buried secrets. Lorenzo led me through a series of rooms that blurred together in a haze of luxury and fear, finally stopping in what appeared to be an office. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, while the 4th was dominated by windows that overlooked the city sprawling below us like a kingdom waiting to be conquered. A massive desk commanded the center of the room, its surface bare except for a single manila folder. Sit, Lorenzo said, gesturing toward one of the leather chairs facing the desk. I remained standing. I want to leave. Now. I'm sure you do. He moved to a bar cart and poured himself 2 fingers of amber liquid that caught the light like liquid gold. Unfortunately, that's not an option until we reach an understanding. About what? He lifted the manila folder from his desk and held it out to me. About this. My hands shook as I opened it, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found inside. Photographs of me at various ages, school records, employment history, medical records, even copies of my grandmother's death certificate, and the subsequent debt notices that had driven me into Marcus Wellington's arms. My entire life laid bare in black and white, catalogued with the thoroughness of a criminal investigation. How did you get this? The words came out strangled, barely audible. I make it my business to know everything about everyone who enters my world, however briefly. Lorenzo settled behind his desk, cradling his drink like a weapon. Isabel Santos, 26 years old, orphaned at 16 when your parents died in a car accident. Raised by your grandmother until she passed last year from complications related to diabetes. Currently employed as an art teacher at Lincoln Elementary, drowning in medical debt you inherited along with her house. Each word was a scalpel, cutting away the privacy I'd thought was mine by right. You had no right to investigate me. I had every right the moment you climbed into my car. His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to having his will obeyed without question. What I find interesting is that someone with your background caught the attention of the Wellington family. They don't marry down, Bella. Ever. Which means there's something about you that made Marcus willing to overlook your limitations. The word hung in the air like a slap. Limitations. As if my poverty and lack of connections were character defects rather than circumstances beyond my control. Maybe he loved me, I said, though the words sounded hollow, even to my own ears. Lorenzo's laugh was sharp and humorless. Marcus Wellington doesn't love anyone but himself, and the fortune his family built on the backs of better men. If he wanted to marry you, it was because you offered something he needed. The question is, what? I stared at the photographs scattered across his desk, images of myself I'd never known existed. Me leaving school, grocery shopping, visiting my grandmother's grave. A life under surveillance I'd never detected. I don't have anything, I whispered. I'm exactly what you said, a nobody with nothing to offer. Then why? Lorenzo leaned forward, his eyes boring into mine with laser intensity. Was Marcus Wellington willing to pay off every penny of your debt to make you his wife? Why did his lawyers draw up prenuptial agreements that were more like acquisition contracts? And why did he look like he wanted to kill someone when you ran? The questions hit like physical blows, each one revealing new layers of manipulation I'd been too naive to recognize. Marcus hadn't saved me from my debts out of love or even pity. He'd bought me, plain and simple, and I'd been too desperate to ask why. "I need to use your phone," I said suddenly. "I need to call someone. Let them know I'm safe." "Who would you call?" The question was casual, but his eyes remained sharp. "According to my research, you have no close friends, no living relatives, no one who would notice if you disappeared for a few days." The accuracy of his assessment was more devastating than any physical blow could have been. I was completely alone in the world, had been since my grandmother's death, with no one to miss me except the 23 students in my art class who wouldn't return from summer break for another month. "This is kidnapping," I said, because it was the only weapon I had left. "This is protection," Lorenzo corrected, rising from his chair with fluid grace. "Because whatever Marcus Wellington wanted from you, he's not going to stop wanting it just because you developed cold feet at the altar. And the Wellington family has resources that make them very dangerous when they don't get what they want." A man appeared in the doorway as if summoned by telepathy, older than the others, with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much. "Signore, the rooms are prepared." "Thank you, Roberto." Lorenzo's attention returned to me. "You'll find everything you need has been provided. Tomorrow we'll discuss this further. Tonight, you need rest. I'm not staying here." "You are." The words carried the finality of a judge's gavel. "Because the alternative is returning to a world where Marcus Wellington is waiting for you. And I assure you, his patience has limits." Roberto stepped forward with deferential courtesy. "If you would follow me, signora." I looked between the two men, seeing no escape in either direction. Lorenzo had made his position clear. I was his guest whether I wanted to be or not. And somewhere out in the storm-dark city, Marcus Wellington was probably discovering that his perfect plan had developed complications. "Fine," I said, gathering the tattered remains of my dignity around me like armor. "But this isn't over." Lorenzo's smile was sharp as a blade. "No, Bella, it's just beginning." I woke in a bed that cost more than my annual salary, wrapped in Egyptian cotton sheets that felt like silk against my skin. For a moment, the opulence made me forget where I was and how I'd gotten here. Then reality crashed back like a physical blow, bringing with it the memory of storm-gray eyes and threats wrapped in silk. The suite Roberto had shown me to rivaled anything I'd seen in luxury hotel magazines. A sitting area with furniture that belonged in museums, a bathroom larger than my entire apartment, and a walk-in closet that had been mysteriously stocked with clothes in my exact size. Designer labels I recognized but had never been able to afford, hung in neat rows, from casual wear to evening gowns that probably cost more than my car. I'd slept in the vintage wedding dress out of sheer stubborn spite, letting the wrinkled silk serve as armor against whatever game Lorenzo Gambino was playing. But morning brought practical concerns, and the need for clean clothes eventually overrode my principles. A soft knock interrupted my internal debate about accepting his hospitality. "Come in," I called, expecting Roberto or another servant. Instead, Lorenzo himself stepped through the door, carrying a silver tray laden with coffee and pastries that smelled like heaven. He'd changed from his storm-soaked clothes into a charcoal suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the dangerous grace of his movements. In the morning light streaming through the windows, he looked less like the mysterious savior from the night before and more like exactly what he was, a predator wearing civilization like an expensive mask. "Sleep well?" he asked, setting the tray on the sitting area's coffee table with movements that spoke of old-world manners drilled into him from birth, as well as anyone can when they're being held against their will. I remained by the windows, using distance as my only defense. "You're not a prisoner, Bella. You're a guest under my protection. Guests can leave when they want to." That ghost of a smile played at the corners of his mouth. Not when leaving would get them killed. The casual mention of death sent ice through my veins, but I refused to let him see my fear. "You're being dramatic." "Am I?" He moved to the windows, stopping close enough that I could smell his cologne. something expensive and masculine that made my pulse quicken despite every rational thought screaming warnings. Tell me, when was the last time you spoke to Marcus? Yesterday, at the church, when I ran. And you think he simply accepted your decision and moved on? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I didn't want to consider. Marcus Wellington wasn't the type to accept rejection gracefully, especially not public humiliation in front of his business associates. He doesn't love me enough to fight for me, I said, though the words felt hollow. Love has nothing to do with this. Lorenzo's voice dropped to that dangerous whisper I was beginning to recognize as his most deadly tone. Whatever arrangement he had with you, whatever he needed you for, it's worth more than wounded pride. Men like Marcus don't give up easily when they've invested time and money in an outcome. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the morning sun. You're trying to scare me. I'm trying to keep you alive. Why? The question burst from me with more force than I'd intended. Why do you care what happens to some nobody teacher? What's in this for you? For the first time since I'd met him, Lorenzo looked genuinely surprised by a question. He studied my face as if I were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve, his storm gray eyes searching for something I wasn't sure I wanted him to find. Maybe I don't like seeing innocents caught in crossfires they didn't create, he said finally. And maybe you're not telling me the whole truth. Truth is a luxury in my world, Bella. One that can get people killed. He moved away from the windows, and I found myself watching the fluid grace of his movements, the way his suit jacket couldn't quite hide the evidence of violence that had shaped his body. There were scars, I realized, seeing the way he favored his left shoulder almost imperceptibly. Eat something, he said, gesturing toward the tray he'd brought. We need to talk. I'm not hungry. You haven't eaten since yesterday morning. I can hear your stomach growling from here. Heat flooded my cheeks at the accuracy of his observation. My body was betraying me, responding to his presence and his care in ways my mind refused to accept. But the coffee smelled like salvation, and the pastries looked like they'd been crafted by angels. I perched on the edge of one of the silk-upholstered chairs, maintaining as much distance as possible while still reaching the coffee. The first sip was perfect, rich and strong with just enough cream to take the edge off. Exactly how I preferred it, though I'd never told him. How did you know? I asked. Know what? How I take my coffee. The clothes in the closet. My size, my style. How did you know all of that? Lorenzo settled into the chair across from me, cradling his own cup with hands that had probably killed men. I make it my business to know things. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're going to get. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of unspoken questions pressing against the ornate walls of the suite. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. Show me the rest of your house, I said impulsively. His eyebrows rose slightly. Why? Because I'm going stir-crazy in here. And if I'm your guest under protection, I should at least know where I'm being protected. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. All right. But there are rules, such as, you don't go anywhere alone. You don't try to leave the property. And you don't ask questions about things that aren't your business. And what exactly is my business? Staying alive, he said simply. The tour that followed was a study in contradictions. Lorenzo's home was undeniably beautiful, filled with art and architecture that spoke of refined taste and unlimited resources. But it was also a fortress, with security measures built seamlessly into the elegance. Cameras hidden behind mirrors, reinforced windows that looked like ordinary glass, and men in expensive suits stationed at strategic points throughout the property. It was in the library that I finally understood something important about the man who held my fate in his hands. The room was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that held thousands of volumes. But these weren't display books chosen for their binding colors. These were books that had been read, with cracked spines and dog-eared pages that spoke of late nights and genuine intellectual curiosity. Dante, I said, running my finger along a particularly worn copy of the Divine Comedy. Shakespeare, Marcus Aurelius. I turned to look at him. You actually read all these? Is that so surprising? Most people in your profession aren't known for their literary interests. Most people in my profession are idiots who think violence is a substitute for intelligence. Lorenzo moved to stand beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I learned early that the mind is a more effective weapon than any gun. Is that what happened to your parents? Someone chose violence over intelligence? The question slipped out before I could stop it, born from genuine curiosity rather than calculated probing. Lorenzo went very still, his expression shuddering in a way that made me wish I could take the words back. "That's not your business," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. They died when I was 15. The words came out clipped, precise, as if he were reciting facts from a case file. Rival family decided to send a message. Car bomb outside their favorite restaurant. I inherited an empire built on blood and violence, and I've spent every day since trying to make it into something different. The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear it anyway, bleeding through the careful composure he wore like armor. Without thinking, I reached out and touched his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles beneath the expensive fabric of his suit. "I'm sorry," I said again, meaning it this time. "Don't be. It taught me that the world is full of predators, and the only way to protect what matters is to be more dangerous than anything that might threaten it." Our eyes met, and something shifted in the air between us. A recognition of shared loss and careful vulnerability. We were both orphans, I realized, both shaped by tragedy into something harder than we'd been born to be. That's when his phone rang, shattering the moment like glass. Lorenzo stepped away to answer it, his voice dropping to rapid Italian that I couldn't understand, but recognized as urgent. When he hung up, his expression had changed, becoming the cold mask of authority I was beginning to dread. "We need to go," he said. "Go where?" "Somewhere safe. Marcus Wellington has mobilized his security team, and they're asking questions about a missing bride." The warehouse district at midnight looked like something from a noir film, all shadows and steam rising from storm drains in the humid summer air. Lorenzo had driven us here in a different car, a nondescript sedan that blended into the industrial landscape like camouflage. His hands gripped the steering wheel with controlled tension, those storm-gray eyes constantly checking the mirrors for signs of pursuit. "Stay in the car," he said, as we pulled into the loading dock of a seemingly abandoned building. "Whatever happens, don't get out." "What's going on? Why are we here?" Before he could answer, his phone buzzed with a message that made his jaw clench. He showed me the screen and my blood turned to ice water. It was a photograph of my best friend Sarah, bound to a chair in what looked like an empty office, her eyes wide with terror above a strip of silver tape covering her mouth. "No," I whispered, my hands flying to my mouth. "No, they wouldn't. She has nothing to do with this." Vincent Torino disagrees. Lorenzo's voice was deadly calm, but I could see the fury burning behind his controlled facade. "He's Marcus Wellington's business partner, and he has your friend. The message is simple. You for her. Then let's go. I'll trade myself. Sarah doesn't deserve this." "Like hell you will." The vehemence in his voice surprised me. "This isn't just about Marcus anymore, Bella. Vincent Torino has been looking for an excuse to move against my family for years. Using you as leverage is just his opening gambit." I stared at the photograph, at Sarah's frightened face, and felt something break inside my chest. She was the only real friend I had left, the only person who'd stood by me through my grandmother's death and the crushing debt that had driven me into Marcus's arms. The idea of her suffering because of choices I'd made was unbearable. "I have to save her," I said. "We will save her," Lorenzo corrected, his hand finding mine across the center console. The touch sent electricity up my arm, warmth and strength that I desperately needed. But we do it smart, not reckless. The warehouse was a maze of shipping containers and industrial equipment, perfect for the kind of clandestine meeting that ended in violence. Lorenzo's men had arrived before us, taking positions in the shadows with military precision. But as we waited in the car, more messages arrived, each one more threatening than the last. "Your parents didn't die in an accident, did they?" The words slipped out before I could stop them, born from a terrible realization that was crystallizing in my mind. The car crash when I was 16. It wasn't random. Lorenzo went very still, his hand tightening around mine. "What makes you say that?" "Marcus knew things about me." Personal things that weren't in any public record. And you said the Wellington family doesn't marry down without a reason. My voice was barely above a whisper. They needed me for something specific, didn't they? Something connected to my parents. Bella, tell me the truth. Please. I deserve to know why my friend is tied to a chair because of something I don't even understand. Lorenzo was quiet for so long, I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of secrets that had been buried for too long. Your father worked for a construction company that built private facilities for people who valued discretion. Warehouses, offices, underground spaces that didn't appear on any city planning documents. He was good at his job, maybe too good. Started noticing patterns in the blueprints, asking questions about why certain buildings needed reinforced soundproofing and multiple escape routes. He was investigating criminal activities. He was an honest man who stumbled onto something bigger than he realized. The Wellington family has been laundering money through construction projects for 30 years, using men like your father to build the infrastructure for their operations. When he started connecting dots, they eliminated the problem. The words hit me like physical blows, each revelation rewriting everything I thought I knew about my life. The brake failure, the investigation that found no evidence of tampering. Money buys silence and selective blindness. Your parents' accident was professionally arranged to look random, and the investigation was handled by officials who knew better than to dig too deep. I pulled my hand free from his, suddenly needing distance from the man who'd just shattered my entire understanding of the past decade. And Marcus? Why did he want to marry me? Because your father hid copies of the blueprints and financial records before he died. Insurance in case something happened to him. Marcus has been looking for them ever since, and marrying you was his way of getting legal access to everything you inherited. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The hasty courtship, the generous offer to pay my debts, the prenuptial agreement that gave him rights to everything I owned. I'd been so grateful for his rescue that I'd never questioned his motives, never wondered why a wealthy man would want to marry someone so far beneath his social station. Where are they? I asked. The documents my father hid. That's what everyone wants to know. I don't have them. I've never seen anything like that. Maybe not. But Marcus believes you know where they are, and Vincent Torino is willing to torture your friend to make you talk. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the night air, their headlights sweeping across the warehouse walls like searchlights. Lorenzo's phone rang, and he answered with a sharp, "What?" His expression darkened as he listened. "How many?" "All right. Move to positions 2 and 3. And remember, the girl stays alive no matter what." He ended the call and looked at me with something that might have been apology in his storm-gray eyes. "They brought more men than we expected. This is going to get ugly fast. I don't care. I won't let Sarah die because of me. And I won't let you walk into a trap that gets you both killed." Lorenzo cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across my cheekbones with surprising gentleness. "Trust me, Bella. Let me handle this." "Why should I trust you? You've kidnapped me, investigated my life without permission, and now you're telling me everything I believed about my parents was a lie. Because despite all of that, I'm the only person in this godforsaken city who gives a damn whether you live or die." Before I could respond, he leaned forward and kissed me. It wasn't gentle or tentative, but fierce and desperate, as if he were trying to transfer some essential part of himself to me through the connection of our mouths. I should have pushed him away, should have been thinking about Sarah and the danger we were walking into. Instead, I found myself kissing him back with equal intensity, my hands fisting in the fabric of his shirt as if I could anchor myself to him against the storm that was threatening to destroy everything I thought I knew. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the warehouse district around us had erupted into chaos. Gunfire echoed off the concrete walls, and the air filled with the acrid smell of smoke and violence. Lorenzo's men were already in motion, shadows moving with deadly purpose through the maze of containers and equipment. "Stay down," Lorenzo ordered, checking the weapon he'd pulled from beneath his jacket. "No matter what happens, don't try to be a hero." But as he prepared to step into the gunfight that would determine whether any of us lived to see morning, I realized that heroes weren't born from safety and comfort. They were forged in moments like this, when the choice between courage and cowardice meant the difference between losing everything and fighting for the people you couldn't bear to lose. "Lorenzo," I called as he reached for the door handle. "Be careful." His smile was sharp as a blade, beautiful and terrible in the reflected glow of muzzle flashes. "Careful is what got us into this mess, Angel. Time to be dangerous." Then he was gone, disappearing into the warehouse where Sarah's life hung in the balance and the truth about my parents' death waited to be written in blood and gunpowder on the concrete floors of Vincent Torino's choosing. The gunfight lasted 23 minutes. I counted every second while crouched in the back seat of Lorenzo's sedan, my grandmother's voice echoing in my memory with words I hadn't thought about in years. "If something happens to me, mija, remember where the butterfly lands when the sun sets." She always knew the important places. At the time, I'd thought she was talking about her garden, about the painted lady butterflies that visited her sunflowers every evening. But as bullets shattered warehouse windows and men shouted orders in multiple languages, a different memory surfaced. The butterfly painting she'd commissioned for my 16th birthday, hanging in her bedroom where the afternoon light hit it just right. Behind that painting, she'd said there was a special place where important things were kept safe. When the silence finally came, it was more terrifying than the chaos that preceded it. Lorenzo emerged from the warehouse carrying Sarah, who was conscious but shaking, her wrists raw from rope burns, and her eyes holding the kind of trauma that would take years to heal. Behind him came his men, supporting a figure I recognized as Vincent Torino, alive, but clearly defeated. "Is she all right?" I asked, reaching for Sarah as Lorenzo helped her into the car. "She will be," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something that might have been relief. Torino talked. "The whole operation is bigger than we realized." Sarah collapsed against me, her body trembling with shock and adrenaline. "Bella," she whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming. "They kept asking about your grandmother, about things she might have left you. They said your parents hid something important." The pieces clicked into place with crystalline clarity. My grandmother hadn't been rambling about butterflies and gardens. She'd been giving me a clue, a way to find whatever my father had hidden before he died. And now that Sarah was safe, I had a choice to make. "I need to go home," I told Lorenzo. "To my grandmother's house. Like hell. Marcus Wellington is probably watching every property connected to you. Then we'll have to be smarter than him." I met his storm-gray eyes, seeing my own determination reflected there. "The documents my father hid. I think I know where they are." Lorenzo studied my face for a long moment, weighing risks against potential rewards. Finally, he nodded. "We do this my way. Full security, complete surveillance sweep, and you don't touch anything until I'm certain it's safe." The drive to my grandmother's house took us through neighborhoods I'd avoided since her funeral, past the small clinic where she'd received her dialysis treatments, and the church where I'd said goodbye to her 6 months ago. The house looked smaller than I remembered, a modest 2-bedroom bungalow with a front garden that had grown wild without her careful tending. Lorenzo's security team arrived first, sweeping the interior for surveillance devices or booby traps, while I waited in the car with Sarah, who'd finally stopped shaking but still flinched at sudden noises. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was returning to my childhood home as the unwilling guest of a man who'd probably killed more people than I'd ever met. "Clear," Roberto's voice crackled through Lorenzo's radio. "But there are signs someone else has been here recently. Windows forced, furniture moved, papers scattered." Marcus had already searched the house. The realization sent ice through my veins, followed by a surge of anger that surprised me with its intensity. This was my grandmother's sanctuary, the place where she taught me to paint and cook, and believe that art could make the world beautiful despite its cruelties. The idea of Marcus's people violating that sacred space made something fierce unfurl in my chest. "He didn't find them," I said with sudden certainty. "He didn't know what to look for." The butterfly painting hung exactly where I remembered, in my grandmother's bedroom facing the window where the afternoon sun created patterns on the faded wallpaper. But now I noticed what I'd missed as a teenager. The frame was slightly larger than the canvas, creating a narrow space between the painting and the backing. "Help me take this down," I told Lorenzo, reaching for the corners of the frame. Together, we lifted the painting from its hook and laid it face down on the bed. The backing was held in place with small metal clips, and when we removed them, A manila envelope fell onto the bedspread like a secret finally ready to be revealed. Inside were blueprints, financial records, and photographs that painted a picture of corruption stretching back decades. The Wellington family had been using construction companies to build money laundering operations throughout the city, creating a network of legitimate businesses that concealed the movement of millions in illegal funds. My father's careful documentation showed not just the where and when, but the who, names, dates, bank account numbers, and enough evidence to destroy not just the Wellington Empire, but several prominent families who'd partnered with them. Jesus, Lorenzo breathed, studying a photograph that showed Marcus shaking hands with Vincent Torino outside a building my father had helped construct. This goes all the way to the top of the city's power structure, but it was the final document that made my blood run cold. A contract dated 3 days after my parents' funeral, signed by Marcus Wellington and transferring ownership of several construction projects to shell companies controlled by offshore accounts. The signature line at the bottom bore my name, forged in my 16-year-old handwriting, giving legal weight to transfers I'd never authorized. He's been using my identity for a decade, I whispered, the magnitude of the betrayal finally sinking in. Everything he's built since my parents died was funded with my stolen legal identity, which makes you the rightful owner of assets worth approximately $50 million, Lorenzo said, his voice carefully neutral, and gives you the power to bring down everyone involved in the conspiracy. The weight of that knowledge settled on my shoulders like lead. I wasn't just a runaway bride anymore. I was the key to unraveling a criminal empire that had cost my parents their lives and shaped the last 10 years of my existence. But with that power came a target painted on my back that wouldn't disappear, just because I wanted to return to my quiet life as an art teacher. I can't go to the police, I said, understanding flooding through me. If this corruption goes as high as these documents suggest, there's no one I can trust. No, Lorenzo agreed. There isn't. What about the FBI? Federal investigators who aren't connected to the local power structure? Lorenzo was quiet for a moment, studying the financial records with an expression I couldn't read. When he looked up, something had changed in his eyes, a coldness that made me remember exactly who I was dealing with. We need to get out of here, he said, gathering the documents with urgent efficiency. Now, what's wrong? I recognize some of these bank account numbers. They're not just laundering money for the Wellington family. His voice carried a deadly calm that sent shivers down my spine. They're funding operations that compete directly with mine. Vincent Torino wasn't just Marcus's partner. He was building a war chest to destroy my family. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the evening air, their engines growing louder as they turned onto my grandmother's quiet street. Lorenzo moved to the window, his body language shifting into the predatory alertness I'd seen at the warehouse. 4 cars, maybe more, he said, reaching for the weapon beneath his jacket. Marcus brought backup this time. The back door? I suggested, clutching the manila envelope against my chest like armor. Probably covered. Lorenzo's phone buzzed with a message that made his jaw clench. They want to negotiate. They'll trade Sarah's continued safety for you and the documents. The words hit me like a physical blow. I thought Sarah was safe. You said... I said we rescued her from the warehouse. I didn't say Torino's people don't have more resources. Lorenzo met my eyes, and I saw something that might have been regret in their storm-gray depths. This is bigger than either of us realized, Bella. And now you have to choose. Trust me completely, or watch everyone you care about pay the price for your father's honesty. Outside, car doors slammed and male voices called orders in the growing darkness. The butterfly painting lay forgotten on my grandmother's bed, its bright wings no longer able to guide me toward safety. I was 26 years old, orphaned twice over, and holding documents that could either save me or get me killed, depending on who I chose to trust with the truth my father had died protecting. I choose you, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. I choose this life. The safe house was a penthouse apartment in the financial district, sterile and anonymous as a hotel room, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city's glittering arteries. We'd escaped my grandmother's house through a series of moves that felt choreographed. Lorenzo's security team creating diversions while we slipped out the back and through a neighbor's yard to a waiting motorcycle that carried us through the night like shadows fleeing the light. Sarah was safe. relocated to a secure facility under federal protection after Lorenzo made a call that demonstrated connections I was still learning to understand. The documents from my father's hiding place lay spread across the penthouse's dining table, like evidence in a war crimes tribunal, each page revealing new layers of corruption that stretched through the city's power structure, like cancer through healthy tissue. "The bank account numbers," I said, tracing my finger along a column of figures that had been haunting me since we'd fled. "You said you recognized them. What did you mean?" Lorenzo stood silhouetted against the windows, his white shirt gleaming in the reflected light of the city below. He'd discarded his jacket and tie somewhere during our escape, and the casual attire made him look younger, more vulnerable. But when he turned to face me, his storm-gray eyes held depths I was still learning to navigate. "For the past 3 years, someone has been systematically undermining my business operations." "Legitimate operations," he emphasized, perhaps seeing the skepticism on my face. "Construction contracts canceled, import licenses revoked, city permits mysteriously delayed. I thought it was normal business competition until my accountants started tracking the money trail. It led back to these accounts. Some of them." He moved to the table, pointing to a series of transactions that created a pattern I hadn't noticed before. Vincent Torino was using laundered Wellington money to bribe officials, judges, anyone who could make my life difficult without resorting to outright violence. The revelation shifted my understanding of the entire conspiracy. This wasn't just about hiding illegal profits. It was economic warfare disguised as legitimate business practices. They were trying to force you back into purely criminal activities. Exactly. Make it impossible for me to operate legally, and I'd have no choice but to return to the old ways. Drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, human trafficking, the kind of business that generates massive profits, but requires constant violence to maintain. "But you didn't take the bait." Lorenzo's smile was sharp as broken glass. "I've spent 8 years building something different. My father's generation ruled through fear and bloodshed. But that model doesn't scale in the modern world. Real power comes from being indispensable to the legitimate economy, not from being its enemy." I studied the financial records with new understanding, seeing how the Wellington family had been working to destroy Lorenzo's transformation from crime lord to business mogul. They needed you to be a monster so they could position themselves as the civilized alternative, while secretly being far worse monsters than I ever was. The weight of that truth settled between us. Marcus Wellington, with his perfect manners and country club connections, had been orchestrating criminal activities that made traditional organized crime look like amateur hour. The realization that I'd almost married him, almost given him legal access to the evidence that could destroy him, made my skin crawl with revulsion. "There's something else," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper I'd learned to associate with revelations that changed everything. "The documents show payments to federal agents, specific amounts on specific dates. Your father wasn't just tracking local corruption. He'd identified federal investigators who were taking money to look the other way." My heart stopped. "The FBI agents I was going to contact? At least 3 of them are on Torino's payroll. If you'd gone to federal authorities with this evidence, you'd have handed it directly to the people it incriminates." The betrayal cut deeper than anything Marcus had done. I'd been so focused on finding someone outside the local power structure that I hadn't considered the possibility that the corruption reached federal levels. How many people can we trust? In law enforcement? Maybe none. Lorenzo moved closer, his presence both comforting and electrifying. In my world? The people who've sworn their loyalty to me personally, not to an abstract concept of justice that can be bought and sold. "Your world," I repeated, tasting the words. "Is that what I've chosen? To live in a place where loyalty is more valuable than law? You've chosen to survive," he corrected gently. "Everything else we can figure out as we go." He was close enough now that I could see the exhaustion around his eyes, the weight of responsibility that never left his shoulders. This man commanded an empire built on violence and fear, but he'd also risked everything to save a woman he barely knew from a fate she'd stumbled into through pure chance. "Why?" I asked, the question that had been burning inside me since the moment he'd helped me into his car. "Why did you save me? Why risk a war with the Wellington family for someone who means nothing to your business?" Lorenzo's hand came up to cup my face. his thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone with infinite gentleness. Because you ran from a church in a wedding dress, choosing uncertainty over security. Because you tend to wounded men without asking what they've done to deserve their scars. Because you paint butterflies and teach children to see beauty in the world, despite everything ugly that surrounds them. His words stripped away the defenses I'd been building since the moment I'd learned who he was. Those aren't reasons to start a war. No, he agreed, his voice rough with an emotion I couldn't identify. But they're reasons to fight one. Before I could respond, before I could analyze the implications of what he was saying, his mouth was on mine. This kiss was different from the desperate claiming at the warehouse. Deeper, more reverent, as if he were trying to memorize the taste and texture of my surrender. My hands found their way to his shoulders, feeling the strength coiled beneath his shirt, the scars that told stories I was only beginning to understand. When we broke apart, both breathing hard, something fundamental had shifted between us. This wasn't just about protection anymore. Wasn't just about the documents that could reshape the city's power structure. This was about two people who'd found something worth fighting for in each other's arms. The gala, Lorenzo said suddenly, his attention caught by something in the financial records. Tomorrow night, the Children's Hospital fundraiser that Marcus was supposed to attend with you as his wife. I followed his gaze to an entry showing a massive donation from Wellington Industries to the hospital's building fund. He's still planning to go? He has to. The donation is public record, and backing out would raise questions he can't afford to answer. Lorenzo's expression turned predatory. But the gala also represents an opportunity. 800 of the city's most powerful people in one room, including several who appear in these financial records. You want to expose the corruption publicly? I want to end this war before it destroys everything we're trying to build. His gray eyes met mine, holding a question I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. But I need a partner, not just a protected witness. Someone who understands what's at stake and is willing to see this through to the end. The penthouse fell silent, except for the distant hum of city traffic far below. Through the windows, dawn was beginning to touch the eastern sky with fingers of gold and pink. In a few hours, the city would wake to another day of routine corruption and accepted lies. But I held the power to change that, to honor my parents' sacrifice by finishing what they'd started. What do you need me to do? I asked. Lorenzo's smile was fierce and beautiful and terrible. I need you to walk into that gala as my partner and help me burn their empire to the ground. And after? When the smoke clears and the corruption is exposed? After, he said, pulling me against him as the first light of dawn painted the city in shades of hope and possibility. We build something better from the ashes. The Grand Metropolitan Hotel sparkled like a jeweled crown against the night sky, its ballroom transformed into a wonderland of crystal chandeliers and champagne fountains for the Children's Hospital Gala. 800 of the city's elite mingled beneath soaring ceilings painted with cherubs and clouds, their designer gowns and perfectly tailored tuxedos creating a sea of expensive elegance that masked the rot beneath. I stood at Lorenzo's side in a midnight blue gown that cost more than my annual teaching salary, feeling like an imposter among these titans of industry and politics. But the weight of the documents in my purse, copies of the evidence that would destroy half the people in this room, reminded me that I belonged here more than any of them realized. I wasn't just Lorenzo Gambino's date for the evening. I was Justice wearing Valentino and carrying a metaphorical sword. Breathe, Lorenzo murmured against my ear, his hand warm and steady at the small of my back. He looked devastating in his black tuxedo, every inch the sophisticated businessman, but I could feel the coiled violence beneath his polished exterior. Remember, we're here to make an announcement, not start a massacre. Easy for you to say. You weren't supposed to marry into this world of corruption. No. I was born into something far worse and chose to make it better. His gray eyes found mine, holding steady despite the chaos we were about to unleash. Tonight, we finish what your parents started. Across the ballroom, Marcus Wellington held court near the silent auction tables, his blonde hair perfectly styled and his smile as sharp as a razor blade. He'd brought a different date, some senator's daughter with empty eyes and a practiced laugh. But his attention kept drifting through the crowd as if searching for something he'd lost. When his gaze finally found mine, the hatred that flashed across his features was so intense, it nearly made me step backward. He knows, I whispered to Lorenzo. Good. Let him sweat while we set the stage. The evening's program began with speeches from hospital administrators thanking donors for their generosity. But I barely heard the words, too focused on watching the faces in the crowd, identifying the men and women whose names appeared in my father's financial records. City councilmen who'd voted to approve construction projects in exchange for briefcases full of cash. Federal judges who'd dismissed cases against Wellington Industries despite overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing. Police commissioners who'd looked the other way while crimes were committed in broad daylight. All of them here tonight, celebrating their charitable contributions while hiding the blood money that funded their lifestyles. Ladies and gentlemen, the evening's host announced, we have a special surprise presentation this evening. Mr. Lorenzo Gambino has asked to address our gathering. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Lorenzo stepped toward the podium. I knew many of these people had heard his name whispered in boardrooms and country clubs, knew what he represented to their carefully ordered world, but none of them had expected him to appear at their sacred fundraiser, forcing them to acknowledge his presence in their sanitized universe. Thank you, Lorenzo said, his voice carrying easily through the vast ballroom. I'm here tonight to talk about justice, about the price we pay when corruption masquerades as charity, when criminals wear tuxedos and hide behind philanthropic donations. The murmur grew louder, more agitated. Several couples near the back began moving toward the exits, but I noticed Lorenzo's security team had positioned themselves strategically throughout the room. No one was leaving until we'd finished our presentation. 10 years ago, Lorenzo continued, 2 honest people died because they discovered evidence of a conspiracy that reaches into every level of this city's government. Their deaths were made to look accidental, but their daughter survived, and she's been carrying their legacy ever since. He gestured for me to join him at the podium, and despite the terror coursing through my veins, I walked forward on unsteady legs. 800 pairs of eyes focused on me like spotlights, but it was Marcus Wellington's furious glare that held my attention. Bella Santos, Lorenzo said, his hand finding mine and squeezing gently. Daughter of Miguel and Carmen Santos, whose only crime was refusing to participate in the destruction of their city. I took the microphone with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of a decade's worth of lies pressing against my chest. My parents died because they discovered that Wellington Industries was using construction projects to launder money for criminal organizations. They left behind evidence of corruption that reaches into the FBI, federal courts, and this city's highest offices. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Voices raised in protest and denial, chairs scraping against marble floors as people tried to leave, the sharp sound of champagne glasses shattering as they hit the ground. But through it all, I kept speaking, my voice growing stronger with each revelation. The man who was supposed to marry me yesterday, Marcus Wellington, has been using my stolen identity for 10 years to authorize financial transactions worth over $50 million. Money laundered through children's charities, hospital donations, and construction projects that created safe houses for human traffickers. You lying bitch. Marcus's voice cut through the noise as he pushed through the crowd toward the stage. His perfect composure had finally cracked, revealing the violent criminal beneath the tailored suit. You have no proof of any of this. Actually, I do. I reached into my purse and withdrew the manila envelope that had been hidden behind my grandmother's butterfly painting. Financial records, photographs, bank account numbers, and recorded conversations that document every transaction, every bribe, every murder committed to protect this conspiracy. That's when Marcus pulled the gun. The ballroom fell silent, except for the sound of several women screaming and men shouting orders, as security teams from multiple organizations suddenly appeared throughout the room. Marcus held a small pistol pointed directly at my chest, his perfectly manicured finger trembling on the trigger. You should have married me when you had the chance, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden stillness. Should have kept your mouth shut and played your part like a good little wife. Like my mother should have kept her mouth shut, I shot back, surprising myself with my steadiness. Like my father should have ignored the evidence of your family's crimes? Your parents were collateral damage in a business dispute. Nothing personal. Everything about this is personal. Lorenzo stepped between Marcus and me, his movements fluid despite the weapon trained on us. You made it personal when you decided to use her parents' deaths to steal her identity. When you tortured her best friend to find documents you had no right to possess. Stand down, Gambino, Marcus snarled. This doesn't concern your organization. It concerns me when someone threatens what's mine. The possessive claims should have bothered me, should have triggered my independent streak and feminist principles. Instead, it sent heat flooding through my body, a primitive recognition that this dangerous man was willing to die protecting me from the monsters who destroyed my family. Vincent Torino is already in federal custody, I announced, watching Marcus's face go pale, along with the bank records that show exactly how much money he paid federal agents to cover up your family's crimes. The corruption stops tonight. You naive little girl. Marcus laughed, but the sound was desperate rather than amused. You think exposing this will change anything? There are a dozen other operations ready to take Wellington Industries' place. The system is bigger than any one family. Maybe, Lorenzo said calmly. But every system has weak points, and you've just become one of them. The shot came from behind Marcus, not from his gun. Vincent Torino had somehow escaped federal custody and made his way into the ballroom, his own weapon drawn and pointed at the man who'd betrayed him. Marcus spun around, his pistol tracking toward this new threat. And in that moment of distraction, Lorenzo moved. The fight lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. Lorenzo's training was evident in every economical movement as he disarmed Marcus and sent him crashing into the silent auction tables. Torino fired twice more, the bullets shattering champagne bottles and sending guests diving for cover behind overturned tables. I didn't think, didn't plan, didn't consider the consequences. When I saw Torino taking aim at Lorenzo's back while he fought with Marcus, I grabbed the nearest heavy object, a crystal champagne bucket, and threw it with all the strength my grandmother had built into my arms through years of painting and sculpting. The impact sent Torino staggering backward, his shot going wide. Lorenzo finished the fight with Marcus and spun to face this new threat. But Torino was already falling, his head striking the marble floor with a sound that would haunt my dreams for years. In the sudden silence that followed, sirens wailed in the distance. Not just police, but federal agents who'd finally received clean intelligence about the corruption in their own ranks. The guests who remained in the ballroom stood frozen, waiting to see who would survive the collapse of their carefully constructed world of lies. It's over, I said, looking around at the faces of men and women who'd spent decades hiding behind charitable donations and political connections. All of it. The files are already in the hands of federal prosecutors who aren't on your payroll. Marcus Wellington, blood streaming from his nose and his perfect hair finally mussed, looked up at me from the ruins of his family's empire. You have no idea what you've destroyed tonight. I know exactly what I've destroyed, I replied, taking Lorenzo's offered hand and stepping over the crystal fragments that glittered like stars on the marble floor. I've destroyed the machine that killed my parents. Everything else is just collateral damage. As federal agents flooded into the ballroom to begin the largest corruption sweep in the city's history, Lorenzo squeezed my hand tightly. You're not the same frightened girl who ran from the altar, he said, his voice rough with something that might have been pride. No, I agreed, watching Marcus Wellington disappear in handcuffs while the city's power structure collapsed around us like a house of cards. I'm not the same girl at all. I'm your partner now, your queen. And as we walked out of the ballroom together, past the wreckage of the old order and toward whatever we would build from its ashes, I finally understood what my grandmother had meant about butterflies finding their way to important places. Sometimes you had to burn down the garden before new flowers could bloom. 6 months later, the Tuscan vineyard stretched across rolling hills like something painted by Renaissance masters, rows of grapevines creating geometric patterns against the golden afternoon light. From the terrace of our villa, I could see workers moving between the vines, their voices carrying on the warm breeze as they prepared for the evening harvest. It was impossibly beautiful, impossibly peaceful, and impossibly far from the woman I'd been just half a year ago. You're thinking too loudly again, Lorenzo said, emerging from the villa with 2 glasses of wine, and that knowing smile I'd learned to both love and fear. He'd traded his severe business suits for linen pants and white shirts that emphasized the bronze his skin had acquired under the Italian sun. but his eyes still held depth that spoke of controlled violence held in careful check. "I was thinking about how strange it is to own a vineyard," I said, accepting the glass he offered. The wine was from our own grapes, pressed from vines that had been growing on this land for centuries. Our land now, part of the empire we'd built from the ashes of the Wellington conspiracy. 6 months ago, I was a teacher drowning in debt. Now I'm an international businesswoman with holdings in 3 countries. You're much more than that. Lorenzo settled beside me on the stone bench, his shoulder warm against mine. You're the woman who brought down the most powerful criminal organization on the East Coast. You're the architect of the Santos Foundation for Children's Education. You're my partner in every sense of the word. The Santos Foundation had been my idea, a way to honor my parents' memory while ensuring that the $50 million we'd recovered from Marcus Wellington's illegal activities went towards something meaningful. We'd established schools in underserved communities, art programs for at-risk youth, and scholarship funds for children who'd lost their parents to violence. It wasn't enough to bring back the people who'd died because of the Wellington family's greed, but it was a start toward healing the wounds they'd inflicted. Sometimes I still can't believe it worked, I said, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, that we actually managed to expose all of them. Marcus Wellington is serving life in federal prison. Vincent Torino died trying to escape justice. 17 federal agents, 12 judges, and 43 city officials have been convicted on corruption charges. Lorenzo's voice carried satisfaction mixed with something darker. The old system is broken beyond repair, and we built something better in its place. We're still building it. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. The exposure of the Wellington conspiracy had sent shockwaves through the city's power structure, creating a vacuum that could have been filled by even worse predators. But Lorenzo had been preparing for this opportunity for years, positioning his legitimate businesses to step into the void left by the corrupt organizations we'd destroyed. Gambino Industries now controlled construction, shipping, and real estate development throughout the metropolitan area, but it operated with transparency that would have been unthinkable in his father's generation. Every contract was public record, every transaction scrutinized by independent auditors, every employee protected by labor agreements that set industry standards for workers' rights. "Roberto called while you were painting," Lorenzo said, referring to his second-in-command who'd remained in the city to oversee operations. "The waterfront development project has been approved by the new city council. Groundbreaking starts next month. That's the housing project for displaced families? Mixed-income housing, community center, medical clinic, and educational facilities. Everything we talked about." His arm came around my shoulders, pulling me closer against his warmth. "Your design for the Children's Art Center was approved unanimously." Heat flooded my cheeks at the compliment. I'd never stopped painting, even as my life transformed beyond recognition. But now my art served a different purpose, creating spaces where children could find beauty and hope, despite the darkness that might surround them. The portfolio Lorenzo had commissioned for the waterfront project was some of my best work. Architectural sketches infused with the kind of optimism I'd never thought possible in my old life. "There's something else Roberto mentioned," Lorenzo continued, his voice dropping to that careful tone I'd learned to recognize as significant. "A marriage proposal." My heart stopped for a moment before I realized he was talking about business, not us. "From who?" "The Romano family in Chicago. They want to formalize an alliance through a marriage between their daughter and one of my cousins. And I told them the era of arranged marriages ended with my generation. If my cousin wants to marry their daughter, he'll court her properly and ask for her consent, not her father's permission." The casual rejection of old-world traditions spoke to how much Lorenzo had changed from the man who'd first commanded my presence in his car. Power hadn't softened him, but love had made him more human. The fierce protector who'd saved me from Marcus Wellington had evolved into a partner who valued my opinions and honored my independence, even as we built a life together. "Speaking of marriage proposals," he said, and this time his voice held something that made my pulse quicken. I turned to look at him, seeing something in his storm-gray eyes that I'd never seen before. Vulnerability mixed with hope. Fear combined with determination. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box that caught the afternoon light like a promise. "Lorenzo, I know what you're thinking," he interrupted gently. "We've been through too much, changed too much to rush into anything traditional. But I also know that every morning I wake up grateful that you chose to trust me instead of running from me. Every night I fall asleep, knowing that I'd burn down the world before I'd let anyone hurt you." He opened the box to reveal a ring that took my breath away. Not a traditional diamond, but a sapphire the color of storm clouds surrounded by smaller stones that caught the light like stars. It was beautiful and unusual, and perfectly suited to the unconventional love story we'd written together. "This isn't about ownership or control or any of the reasons people in my world usually marry," Lorenzo continued. "This is about choosing each other, every day, for the rest of our lives. About building something beautiful together, from the foundation of trust we've created." I stared at the ring, at the man offering it, at the life spread before us like a golden path toward an uncertain but hopeful future. 6 months ago, I'd been a runaway bride fleeing from a man who'd seen me as nothing more than a signature on paperwork. Now I was being asked to marry someone who'd seen me at my weakest and helped me discover strengths I'd never known I possessed. "Yes," I said, the word emerging as naturally as breathing. "Yes, I'll marry you. I'll build this life with you. I'll be your partner in everything." The ring slid onto my finger like it had been made for me, which I suspected it had been. Lorenzo had probably been planning this proposal for weeks, studying my preferences and commissioning something unique to our story. The thought made me laugh, a sound of pure joy that echoed across the vineyard. "What's so funny?" he asked, though he was smiling too. "I was just thinking about how this all started. You told me I'd escaped my wedding and climbed into the car of the most dangerous man in the city. You did, but you were wrong about one thing." I leaned closer, close enough to see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, close enough to smell the scent that would always mean safety and home to me. "You weren't the most dangerous man I met that night. I was the most dangerous woman. And I just didn't know it yet." His laugh was rich and warm, the sound of a man who'd found something worth more than all the power and wealth he commanded. "You're right. You destroyed an empire, brought down a criminal conspiracy, and transformed a monster into a man worth loving. You're the most dangerous woman in any city, and you love me anyway. I love you because of it." We kissed as the sun set over our vineyard, over the life we'd built from violence and betrayal and desperate choices made in the rain outside a church. Tomorrow we'd return to the city to oversee the empire we'd created together, to continue the work of transformation that would take years to complete. There would be new challenges, new enemies, new battles to fight for the future we envisioned. But tonight, we were simply Lorenzo and Bella, two people who'd found each other in the darkness and chosen to create light together. The butterfly painting from my grandmother's house hung in our bedroom now, a reminder that important things always found their way to where they belonged, even when the path seemed impossible to navigate. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, I thought about the scared young woman who'd fled her wedding in a rainstorm. She'd been looking for escape, for safety, for someone to save her from a fate she couldn't accept. Instead, she'd found something infinitely more valuable. She'd found herself, and in doing so, she'd found the love that would transform them both. Sometimes the best things in life really do come from the most unexpected places. Like finding your soulmate in the backseat of a stranger's car on what felt like the worst night of your life, only to discover it was actually the first night of the rest of your life. The night everything began.